Welcome to AudioCert, where the official study guides are brought to life. And welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really critical chapter, Chapter 5, from the Certified Cloud Security Professional. That's the CCSP curriculum.
That's right.
Now, this certification, it's all about mastering cloud security, the operations, the governance, and it really hammers home understanding not just what the risks are, but crucially, who actually owns them.
Mm-hmm.
And Chapter 5, Security in the Cloud, well, this is where theory meets practice, you know? It forces us to look beyond just the tech diagrams and into the sometimes messy reality of legal liability and the actual contracts we sign.
Absolutely spot on. Our mission today really is to dissect this whole security landscape, especially when organizations move their important assets into these shared remote cloud environments.
Okay.
We need to look closely at the risks, define how responsibilities shift. That's the whole shared responsibility model idea. And very importantly, examine those critical business continuity and disaster recovery strategies. BCDR.
Right, BCDR.
These have to be negotiated and tested before anything goes wrong, not after.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what strikes me about this chapter, and honestly what makes it kind of challenging, is that it pulls everything together. It's not just one domain.
No, it's a blend.
We're seeing elements from Domain 1 on architecture, Domain 3 on infrastructure security, Domain 5, which covers operations, and maybe most critically, Domain 6, that's legal, risk, and compliance.
Exactly.
So if you can grasp how all these pieces connect, as laid out here in Chapter 5, you've really understood the bigger picture of cloud security posture.
And that context is so vital, because without it, something like the shared responsibility model, it might just seem like, well, vendor marketing jargon, instead of what it actually is, a legally defined relationship.
Yeah.
This chapter is all about understanding where that control really ends and where legal accountability begins. It's fundamental.
Okay, so let's dive in. Maybe we should start with the biggest, heaviest concept first, legal liability.
Good place to start.
When our data leaves our physical control, moves into a provider's data center, we're not the sole operator anymore. We're now the cloud customer dealing with a cloud provider.
Right.
And we need to formalize this using those terms, data owner or controller versus the data custodian or processor.
This is the bedrock. It's the foundation for pretty much every cloud security contract out there. And the absolute core legal principle, and you really can't stress this enough, is that the ultimate legal liability for, say, unauthorized data disclosure, it always stays with the customer. The customer is the data owner, the controller. Always.
Hang on, I need to push on this a bit because we often hear, if the provider messes up, maybe they're negligent, have a huge config error, or system bug leads to a breach.
Right.
Surely the contract makes them financially liable, but you're saying the legal burden, the responsibility under the law stays with us, the customer.
Precisely, yes. The provider might absolutely be financially liable. They could end up paying millions in fines or damages, depending on what the contract says. They're the data processor or the custodian.
Okay.
But that legal responsibility to comply with data protection laws, the GDPR, IPA, GLBA, that responsibility is fundamentally tied to the data controller.
The customer.
The customer. So if there's a serious breach, maybe involving personally identifiable information or PII,
right.
It's the government or the regulatory bodies. They're going to issue injunctions, compliance orders, seek damages from the customer organization. They might even, in severe cases, pursue officer imprisonment against the customer's leadership.
Wow. That distinction it's huge. So the regulators hold us, the customer, accountable because we made the final policy decision to use that specific provider. We keep that fiduciary duty to the people whose data it is.
It's exactly right. The data owner sets the policies for how data is processed, and they are legally bound to make sure those policies meet all the regulatory requirements. The provider, the custodian, they're just contracted to follow those policies.
So if the custodian fails?
If the custodian fails, the owner is still legally responsible for the failure of the policy to protect the data. And critically, beyond just the cash liability, the customer suffers those awful hidden costs.
Yeah, the reputation.
Reputational damage, immediately losing trust with your clients, decreased market share, your insurance premiums skyrocket. Cash liability is just one piece of the total risk puzzle. And that burden, it stays with the customer, even if the providers screw up. Their negligence was the direct cause.
Okay. So understanding that the legal liability is fixed with us, the customer's entire focus has got to be on forcing the provider to take on the maximum possible operational control, right? And ensuring the contract protects us as much as possible.
Great.
Which brings us neatly to the shared responsibility model.
Yes. This model, it's a visual way to show how responsibility shifts depending on what kind of service model you buy. Infrastructure, platform, or software.
Let's walk through that spectrum, starting with the one where we keep the most control. Infrastructure as a service, or IS.
All right. With IS, the customer, you keep control over data security, application security, and platform security. You're managing the operating system, the software you install, the data itself.
So the provider mostly handles the underlying stuff.
Exactly. The foundational infrastructure, networking, storage, the physical security of their data center. That's their primary domain in IS.
Okay, moving up to platform as a service, PaaS.
Here, the provider takes a much bigger chunk of responsibility. They often manage the operating system, the middleware, sometimes the runtime environment, basically what we call platform security.
So the customer focuses more tightly.
Almost entirely on their specific application and the data, much less infrastructure worry.
And then at the other end of the spectrum, software as a service, SaaS.
With SaaS, the provider controls pretty much everything below that data layer. Your security responsibility as the customer shrinks down mainly to securing the data itself, managing user authentication, and ensuring compliance, governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, regarding how that data gets used.
So this model really drives the negotiation, doesn't it? We're always trying to push that line of control further towards the provider.
And this naturally leads to what we call the adversarial dynamic in negotiation. It sounds negative, but it's just the reality.
How so?
Well, the customer, focused on maintaining their legal integrity and control, demands maximum visibility. They want to impose detailed security policies, get fine-grained logging and auditing data, access performance metrics. Transparency is their goal.
Makes sense. But the provider?
The provider's core business is efficiency, scale, and often the secrecy of their proprietary operational methods. So they naturally try to limit customer access, minimize disclosure about how they run things. Sometimes they won't even tell you the exact physical location of the data center. They see that operational secrecy as a security control itself.
That creates a real information imbalance then.
A huge asymmetry of information. The provider knows their setup inside and out. The average customer doesn't. Plus, providers often use standardized contracts, legal boilerplate, that heavily favor their own interests.
So they usually have the upper hand in negotiations.
Typically, yes. Which leads to a key takeaway for anyone listening. If your organization is new to the cloud, you absolutely must get external help, consultation, to understand exactly what insight and control you need to negotiate for, especially around critical things like audit rights and having a clearly defined workable exit strategy.
This asymmetry, this sort of adversarial stance, it also forces a big shift in how we think about defense, right? Because we're moving data somewhere where the physical perimeter belongs to someone else, and it's accessible remotely by design.
That leads perfectly to the mindset that the cloud environment is essentially a demilitarized zone, or DMZ.
Like the old network DMZ.
Exactly like that.
Yeah.
In legacy setups, the DMZ was the bit exposed to the wild internet. If you treat the cloud as fundamentally exposed, potentially porous,
Okay.
you immediately realize that traditional network controls, like your big perimeter firewalls, they become less effective. They're not the main defense anymore.
So what is the main defense?
It forces you to prioritize controls that travel with the data. Things like strong encryption, data masking, robust identity management. Controls tied to the data itself, not just its network location.
Okay, so if the legal liability is fixed with us, the customer, that understanding has to drive every decision about structure. Let's transition now to how risk changes based on where the service is actually deployed. The four main deployment models: private, community, public, and hybrid.
Right. Let's start with the private cloud. This is an environment, often distributed, but dedicated entirely to a single customer.
High control, then.
Very high control. You can dictate detailed, customized security policies. It's popular in highly regulated industries, think government, financial services. They like that control.
But there's always a trade-off, isn't there?
Always. The high control often comes at the cost of elasticity and scaling capacity. You're limited by the dedicated hardware you've paid for.
And the risks don't just disappear.
Not at all. Even with that control, the risks are still significant. You have personnel threats, especially if the provider's administrators manage the environment but are outside your direct control.
Right.
Physical risks like natural disasters still apply. External attacks like denial of service or distributed denial of service, DDoS. Regulatory noncompliance is still a risk if your configurations aren't right. And of course, malware. You have more control over mitigation, sure, but you haven't eliminated the inherent risks of any complex IP system.
Okay. Next up, the community cloud. This is where resources are shared, but among a specific group, right? An affinity group.
Exactly. Think of organizations with similar needs or regulatory requirements. Maybe a group of healthcare providers sharing certain resources.
This one sounds interesting. A mix of shared and private.
It presents a fascinating risk-benefit equation. The benefit. Resiliency through shared ownership, and often lower costs than private. If one member organization has an outage, the shared services might stay up.
But the risk side.
That very resiliency introduces risk. A vulnerability found in one member setup, one node, can potentially spread and affect others in the community. And because administration is often decentralized, achieving unified configuration management, making sure everyone is patched and secure the same way, it's almost impossible.
So the benefit of shared cost and resiliency, is it worth that risk of decentralized control? How do you weigh that?
You weigh it by looking at the operational reality. Since you, as one customer organization, don't own the entire stack, you simply cannot guarantee reliable, consistent security standards across the whole community.
Can you give an example?
Imagine a community bank setup. Several banks share a platform. They all agree on a baseline security standard. But one bank absolutely insists on keeping an old, vulnerable piece of middleware running because they have some ancient legacy app they can't replace yet.
Ah, okay.
That single weakness becomes a potential entry point, a vulnerability for the entire community cloud. It's that classic weakest link problem,
Right.
but amplified because the infrastructure is shared.
Okay. Now for the big one, the most common model for many users, the public cloud. Massive scalability, cost benefits, but also the big challenge of multi-tenancy, sharing with potentially thousands of others.
Exactly. And the first major risk we absolutely have to address here is vendor lock-in, sometimes called provider lock-in.
This is dependency, right? Getting stuck.
It's dependency created precisely because you've ceded control over the underlying infrastructure or platform. Moving your data out can become incredibly expensive, technically difficult, maybe even impossible if the provider uses proprietary data formats you can't easily read elsewhere, or if the contract has punitive terms for leaving.
So the goal must be to enhance portability. What are the absolute must-have countermeasures for us as customers?
Okay, number one, a clear, unambiguous exit strategy has to be built into the contract from day one. You need favorable terms for getting your data back, guaranteed access, defined timelines.
Non-negotiable. What else?
Second, avoid proprietary formats wherever possible. Your data needs to be recoverable in a standard format that other systems can actually use. Third, check the physical realities. Does the provider actually have enough physical bandwidth for you to pull terabytes or petabytes of data out in a reasonable time frame? Don't assume they do.
Good point. And fourth.
Fourth, regulatory constraints.
Oh.
If your data has to meet multiple complex standards simultaneously, say FERPA for education, PCI for payments, HIPAA for health, the pool of providers who can meet all of them might be so small that lock-in becomes almost unavoidable without major data restructuring beforehand.
That narrative example you mentioned about contract ambiguity really hits this home.
Oh, the ambiguity is a scary case. It's a classic trap. So this provider had clear monthly limits on data uploads and downloads, with fees if you went over. Standard stuff.
Okay.
The contract also specified a 30-day notice period if the customer wanted to leave. The customer just assumed that during those final 30 days, while they were pulling all their data out, those monthly limits wouldn't apply. Seems reasonable, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, to facilitate the move.
But the provider argued, nope, the limits are monthly. The exit period is a month. The limits apply. So if the customer needed to move, say, 12 months worth of accumulated data out quickly within that 30-day window.
They'd get hit with 12 times the overage fee just to leave.
Exactly, just to execute their exit strategy. The lesson is brutal. You can never assume the reasonable interpretation. Every single potential ambiguity like that must be identified, discussed, and resolved explicitly in writing before you sign anything.
Wow. Okay, so that's lock-in. The flip side is vendor lockout.
Right. This happens when the provider just disappears, goes out of business, gets acquired by a competitor who might shut down your service, or they simply decide to stop offering the specific service you rely on. Your access to your own data is suddenly threatened.
How do we mitigate that when choosing a provider?
You have to do your due diligence. Look at provider longevity. How long have they been around? Are they financially stable? Assess their core competency. Is cloud service central to their business, or is it just a side hustle they might drop if it's not profitable enough?
Makes sense. What else?
Jurisdictional suitability is huge. Where is the company legally chartered? Critically, where are their actual data centers located? Are they in politically stable regions? You also have to consider their supply chain dependencies. Who do they rely on? And the overall legislative environment. Think about things like Brexit or new data localization laws. Could geopolitical events suddenly impact the provider's ability to operate where your data physically sits?
If we're worried about lockout, does that mean we should only pick providers who claim they've never had a security incident, a perfect record?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
That's falling for the unrealistic zero-fault expectation. Look, every complex organization, especially in tech, will experience an incident eventually. It's inevitable.
So how should we judge them?
You need to judge them on their fault-tolerant environment and, more importantly, their documented response history. How do they handle past incidents? Were they transparent? Did they fix the root cause? Did they demonstrably learn from it? A provider that has weathered storms, fixed things openly, and improved is often a much safer bet than one claiming a flawless record, because the flawless one probably just hasn't been seriously tested yet.
Okay, good perspective. Now let's drill down into the risks that are really specific to that pure multi-tenant environment in the public cloud. Sharing infrastructure creates unique problems.
It really does. First, there's the internal threat of conflict of interest. Think about it. The provider staff, their administrators, might be managing your sensitive data and also managing the data for your direct competitors, housed in the same systems. They have intimate operational knowledge of both sides.
Oof, yeah.
Second, escalation of privilege. This is where unauthorized users, maybe even users from other customer organizations, sharing the same hardware, try to gain illicit administrative access that lets them cross the boundaries between customer environments.
And you mentioned something subtler, information bleed.
Yes. This isn't about accessing raw data directly. It's about one customer potentially gaining intelligence about another customer's activities just by observing the shared system. For instance, they might notice that certain operations on your VM consistently take a specific amount of time, which could hint at the type of processing or security controls you're using. It's inference.
Sneaky. And finally, the disruption from legal activity.
Right. We touched on this. If law enforcement targets customer A with a warrant or subpoena, they might legally seize the entire physical server host. Your data may be on a completely unrelated, non-targeted virtual machine, VM, on that same physical box.
It gets swept up too.
It gets swept up, potentially inspected, or locked away as evidence for however long the investigation takes. The fact that multiple logical customer environments are physically tied to one single piece of hardware is a major risk multiplier in legal scenarios.
It really sounds like rigorous separation between customers, even on shared hardware, is absolutely critical for the provider, both operationally and legally.
It's paramount, which is why, conceptually, we often bring up the Brewer-Nash model. It's also known as the Chinese wall security policy.
The Chinese wall.
It's a formal security model designed specifically to prevent these kinds of conflicts of interest in multi-tenant systems. It works by defining conflict of interest classes. So, if customer A and customer B are direct competitors, they belong to the same conflict class.
Okay, so how does the model enforce the wall between them?
It dictates a simple but powerful rule. Once an administrator, or even an automated system process, accesses data belonging to customer A in a specific conflict class, that administrator or process is then permanently prevented from accessing any data or systems belonging to any other customer within that same conflict class, like customer B. It enforces separation of duties aligned directly with data flows. It builds a logical wall, ensuring that people or processes handling sensitive data for one competitor cannot simultaneously or subsequently access sensitive data of another competitor on the same platform.
That sounds complex to implement.
It is complex, which is why it's often more of a conceptual goal than a perfectly implemented reality. But the principle is vital because the provider acts as the custodian for everyone sharing that space.
Okay. Lastly, in this section, the hybrid cloud. It's a mix of models, right? Like using private for super sensitive stuff and public for scalable web apps.
Exactly. And because it's a combination, it naturally inherits all the risks associated with all the component models it uses. If you use public and private, you get the risks of both.
Plus maybe some unique risks from the combination itself.
Absolutely. The biggest unique risk is management complexity. Trying to establish a single cohesive security policy, a unified view, a single pane of glass across fundamentally different environments is extremely difficult. You're juggling policies for private IA, public SaaS, maybe internal legacy systems too, all trying to fit under one governance, risk, and compliance umbrella. This fragmentation multiplies the chances of policy gaps and dangerous misconfigurations.
All right, we've looked at risks based on where things are deployed, the deployment models. Now let's pivot to the inherent risks based on the service model itself. IS, PIS, and SaaS.
Makes sense. Starting again with IS, infrastructure as a service. As we said, the customer keeps the most control, which sounds good. But they also take on the biggest operational and security load. And the number one practical risk here, honestly, is often the lack of specific skill sets within the customer's own IT staff.
Really, just not having the right people.
Yeah. Managing remote, highly virtualized cloud environments requires specialized expertise. Different tools, different architectures, different security considerations than traditional on-premise data centers.
Right.
If your team lacks that specific training and experience, that operational gap becomes a massive security vulnerability waiting to be exploited.
Okay. Moving up the stack to POLIS, Platform as a Service. What new risks emerge here?
Polis introduces a few tricky ones. One big one is interoperability issues. Remember, with Polis, the provider manages the underlying OS and middleware.
Right.
So let's say the provider pushes out a scheduled OS patch or a middleware update. That update, done for good security reasons, might inadvertently break your application software that runs on top of it. Suddenly you have service outages, or worse, the update might introduce new security flaws in how your app interacts with the platform.
And you mentioned PaaS is often used for development. DevOps teams love it.
They do. And that leads to another significant risk, persistent backdoors. Developers use PaaS for rapid development, testing, deploying code quickly. It's very common for them to leave behind backdoors or maybe weak authentication mechanisms just for easy access during the development and testing phases. The problem is, what was just a convenient test hook yesterday can become a serious zero-day exploit tomorrow if it gets accidentally left active in the production environment and somebody malicious finds it.
And the risk is higher because of the shared responsibility.
Exactly. The provider manages the platform, you manage the app. It creates a potential blind spot where neither party might realize that backdoor is still there. Plus, virtualization and resource sharing on the platform can still lead to that information bleed possibility we discussed.
Okay, and then SaaS, Software as a Service. This inherits all the IIS and PACS risks, you said.
Pretty much, yes. Plus, SaaS often increases the risk of proprietary formats, making vendor lock-in an even bigger concern. You're using their software, their data structures.
And more multi-tenancy means?
Enhanced virtualization risks, just by sheer density. You're likely sharing the underlying resources with many, many more simultaneous customers than in a typical PACS or IS setup. And finally, your primary way of interacting with SaaS is usually through web browsers and APIs.
Which means
a much higher exposure to the whole universe of web application security threats. Things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, authentication flaws. These are often the easiest vectors for attackers to go after, and SaaS relies heavily on these interfaces.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned virtualization risks are enhanced in SaaS, and virtualization underpins everything. Let's do that deep dive into virtualization risks. This feels crucial.
Absolutely essential. If we're thinking of the cloud as a DMZ, then the hypervisor is the absolute key. It's that critical software layer managing the interface between all the virtual machines, the instances, and the physical host hardware underneath.
So attacking the hypervisor is the jackpot for an attacker.
It's the holy grail. Because if you successfully penetrate the hypervisor, you potentially gain control over all the virtual instances running on that physical machine. Game over, potentially for many customers at once.
And there are different types of hypervisors, right? Type 1 and Type 2.
Correct. We differentiate them mainly by how they run. Type 1, often called bare metal, installs directly onto the host machine's hardware. There's no traditional operating system underneath it. It's lean, specialized, and because of that, it has a significantly smaller attack surface. Providers prefer Type 1 for large-scale deployments.
Okay, and Type 2?
Type 2 is the software hypervisor. It runs on top of a conventional underlying operating system, like Windows or Linux. Think VMware Workstation or VirtualBox on your laptop. Attackers generally prefer targeting Type 2 environments.
Why is that?
Because the underlying OS is complex, general purpose, and has a much, much larger surface area for potential exploits. An attacker might target the hypervisor software itself, or they could target vulnerabilities in the underlying operating system, or even other applications running on that host OS to gain leverage. More places to attack.
Okay, so if an attacker gets inside one VM, their next goal is to break out, right?
Yeah.
VM escape. You mentioned two types.
Yes. The first and arguably more common type is guest escape. This is when an attacker or malicious user manages to break out of the confines of their own virtual instance and gain access to other VMs running on the same physical host. Now, they can potentially view or tamper with data belonging to other customers sharing that hardware.
That's bad. What's the other type?
The other, and far more serious scenario, is host escape. This is the worst case. Here, the attacker not only breaks out of their VM, but they manage to break out of the entire host machine's virtualization containment and gain access to other devices on the provider's physical network.
Wow. So they could potentially compromise the provider's management systems.
Potentially, yes. It's very rare, thankfully. It requires exploiting usually multiple severe vulnerabilities in the hypervisor or underlying systems. But if it happens, it's an absolutely catastrophic failure of security controls.
We talked about information bleed earlier. In the context of virtualization, this becomes a specific technical risk, a side channel attack.
Exactly. And it's incredibly subtle, which makes it dangerous. In a side channel attack, the attacker isn't directly accessing your raw data. They can't read your files.
So what are they doing?
They're observing the physical side effects of processing that happens on the shared hardware. For example, they might be able to detect, maybe through timing analysis or power consumption monitoring on the shared CPU, that a specific cryptographic operation is running frequently inside your VM.
Okay.
Maybe they measure that this operation consistently takes, say, 500 milliseconds. That timing information alone, even without seeing the data, could give them clues about the type of encryption algorithm you're using, or the length of the keys, or other security controls you have in place. It helps them narrow down their attack vectors against you, all without ever directly touching your data. It's intelligence gathering through inference.
That's fascinatingly sneaky. And just to reiterate the physical risk we keep mentioning, data seizure.
Yes, worth repeating because it cuts across all models using shared hardware. If law enforcement comes knocking with a warrant for a specific VM, they often seize the entire physical server. Your VM, even if totally unrelated and non-targeted, gets taken along for the ride, potentially leading to data loss, inspection, or unavailability for an extended period.
Okay, let's consolidate. We've identified a lot of threats amplified in the cloud. Let's review those and match them up with specific, practical countermeasures. The big threats seem to be malware, internal threats, both malicious and accidental, external attackers doing things like DOS, man-in-the-middle attacks, MID-M, which seem riskier with remote access, regulatory violations, that loss of policy control, and the big one, the road administrator at the provider level.
That's a good summary. So for malware, especially thinking about our cloud as DMZ model, we need constant vigilance. Countermeasures have to include both host-based and network-based anti-malware solutions. Continuous network traffic monitoring is key.
And patching.
Absolutely critical. Regular patching and updates for everything. And importantly for VMs, you need automated checks to ensure every VM instance meets its security baseline configuration and is fully patched every time it's spun up or instantiated. Not just once a month.
Makes sense. Now, combating internal threats, the personnel risk. This requires strong management policies, right?
Absolutely essential. It starts with aggressive background checks and mandatory skills validation for anyone with privileged access. Operationally, you need enforced mandatory vacations, helps detect fraud that requires ongoing presence and job rotation. Separation of duties and the principle of least privilege are non-negotiable.
And technologically?
Technologically, implement data masking wherever possible to reduce exposure of raw, sensitive data, even to legitimate users. And crucially, you need egress monitoring. That means using data loss prevention, or DLP, solutions to actively monitor and block unauthorized attempts to transfer sensitive data out of the cloud environment.
Okay. What about defending against those external attackers, the large-scale DOS floods or brute force login attempts?
Here you need hardened systems, hardened devices, hardened hypervisors, strong security configuration baselines. Robust access controls are fundamental. And this is where a technology called a Cloud Access Security Broker, or CASB, often becomes really important.
Right, a CASB. Why can't we just rely on our traditional firewall like we did on-premise? Why the need for this specific CASB thing?
Because remember, the traditional perimeter is gone, or at least fundamentally changed. A CASB acts like a central control point, a gatekeeper, sitting between your users, wherever they are, and the cloud services they're accessing.
So it does what a firewall can't.
It provides things a traditional firewall wasn't designed for in this distributed model. Things like consistent identity authentication and authorization across multiple different cloud services. It monitors user activity. What are they doing in Office 365 and Salesforce and AWS? It enforces DLP policies not just at the network edge, but on data in transit to and from the cloud. It helps ensure compliance with the regulations. It's policy enforcement tailored for the cloud reality.
Okay, that makes sense. And beyond just the technical defenses, the firefighting, we need a more forward-looking capability too.
Yes, absolutely. Organizations really need to utilize threat intelligence services. These services provide insight into how adversaries view your organization, what attack methods are currently popular in your industry, what vulnerabilities are being actively exploited in the wild.
So it gives you a heads up.
It gives you predictive capability. It allows you to proactively patch that specific vulnerability before it's used against you, or reconfigure defenses to counter a known attack pattern, rather than just reacting after a breach has already happened.
Speaking of reacting and public perception, that Sony story you mentioned really highlights a failure in understanding risk priorities, doesn't it?
Oh, the 2011 PlayStation Network, the PSN incident. It's a perfect, albeit painful, case study in how not to handle risk escalation. Sony went after a hacker, George Hartz, legally. Why? Because he published an exploit that bypassed their digital rights management, or IRM, controls on the PlayStation 3 console. Sony's entire focus was laser-like on protecting their technical DRM mechanism.
Okay, protect the IP. And what was the result of that narrow focus?
The result was that the hacking collective Anonymous saw this legal action as Sony bullying the user and hacking community. As retaliation, they launched a massive, sustained DDoS attack and breach against the PlayStation Network.
And the damage.
Sony completely lost control. The attack exposed the personal data of around 77 million user accounts. The total cost to Sony remediation, lost revenue, fines, lawsuits was estimated well over $171 million.
Wow.
The lesson is profound. Protecting a single technical control, like IRM, should never come at the expense of ignoring massive, potentially existential brand-level risk, like public perception, user backlash, and reputational damage. Security has to be holistic, always considering the business impact.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. Physical security. How do we handle data loss from theft or loss of devices like laptops or phones accessing cloud data?
Again, in this distributed DMZ-like environment, the data itself has to be protected wherever it goes. That means encryption of all sensitive materials stored on end-user devices is mandatory. Strict physical controls on company-issued devices, limiting or completely disabling USB storage functionality. And for any device that might hold sensitive data, you absolutely need remote wipe or remote kill switch capabilities.
Got it. Now, countering that ultimate insider threat, the rogue administrator, the person at the provider or even internally who holds the keys to the kingdom.
This requires layers of technical and procedural controls. First, detailed immutable logging of all administrative activities is essential. Every privilege command, every configuration change logged, coupled with physical controls, locked server racks, monitored data center access. Financial monitoring of personnel in highly sensitive positions can also be a powerful control, where it's legally permissible.
And analyzing all that log data. Humans can't keep up.
No way. That log data is useless unless it's analyzed. You need automated tools. Security information and event management, SIEM systems, or the related security information management and SIM, or security event management Zoom solutions. These tools correlate events across different systems and flag suspicious patterns indicative of insider abuse.
Okay. And finally, mitigating that risk we keep coming back to. Legal seizure, potentially compromising our data because it's on a shared host.
Here we rely primarily on technical and architectural controls. Encryption of data at rest in the cloud is foundational. If the data is encrypted and law enforcement seizes the disk, they get encrypted bits unless they also compel you to provide the keys.
And the other approach.
Even better, potentially, is data dispersion. This means architecturally spreading your data, maybe sharding it, across multiple different logical or even physical storage locations, perhaps even across different providers or regions. The idea is that seizing one single physical asset doesn't compromise the entire data set, making reconstruction much harder for an unauthorized party.
And one more technical control you mentioned to ensure the VM itself hasn't been messed with, virtual machine introspection, or VMI.
Yes, VMI. This is a really important technical control for ensuring instance integrity. It's typically agentless, meaning no special software needs to run inside the guest operating system that's being monitored.
So how does it work?
It operates from the hypervisor layer, looking into the VM from the outside. It monitors the VM state, its memory contents, CPU registers, network activity, running processes. By comparing the VM's current state against a known good baseline, VMI can detect if the VM's security posture has been tampered with. Maybe malware has altered critical system files or network settings have been changed illicitly. It can spot these deviations without the VM itself or malware inside it, even knowing it's being watched. Set an external security camera for the VM's internals.
All right, we've covered defenses. Now we get to the crucial operational challenge. How disaster recovery, DR, and business continuity, BC, planning fundamentally changes when we move operations to the cloud. This is huge for CCSP domains 3 and 6, the infrastructure and legal risk domains.
Absolutely. When you migrate, your whole business impact analysis, the BIA, needs a major overhaul to account for cloud-specific issues.
What kind of new issues need to be factored into the BIA?
Well, first, you have to identify all the new dependencies. You're not just reliant on your chosen cloud provider anymore. You're reliant on their entire supply chain, their upstream network providers, their hardware vendors, the regional power utilities servicing their data centers, the specialized personnel they employ. A failure anywhere in that chain can impact you.
Okay, that's broader than just the provider contract. What else?
You have to reassess the risk of regulatory failure. Because cloud environments make it so easy to distribute data, maybe across multiple geographic regions, the risk of accidentally violating data privacy laws like GDPR or healthcare rules like HIPAA increases significantly if your controls aren't meticulously designed and enforced everywhere the data might land.
Right, data sovereignty issues.
Exactly. And of course, the BIA must revisit the potential impact of a data breach or inadvertent disclosure in this new context. Since, as we established, you can't fully transfer the legal liability for breaches of PII or Electronic Protected Health Information, EPHI.
Right, that stays with the customer.
The BIA has to realistically calculate the potential costs, fines, legal fees, but especially the costs associated with mandatory data breach notification laws, which can vary wildly depending on the jurisdictions where affected data subjects reside.
And the BIA should also explicitly factor in those risks we talked about earlier, vendor lock-in and vendor lockout.
Definitely. The potential cost and time delays associated with either getting your data out, lock-in, or losing access entirely, lockout, must be quantified as part of the potential business impact of choosing a specific provider or architecture. Fortunately, a lot of the data needed for this part of the BIA should have already been gathered during the initial cost-benefit analysis you did before migrating.
Okay. So assuming we've updated our BIA, let's talk about the actual BCDR strategies in the cloud. You mentioned 3 primary backup methodologies.
Yes, and they really define the complexity of the customer-provider relationship when it comes to recovery.
Let's start with Model 1, private architecture, cloud services backup.
Okay, this is the most traditional setup in a way. Your primary production environment stays where it's always been, maybe in your own data center or a private cloud. The public cloud is used purely as a remote site for storing backups, a contingency location.
So the customer keeps control.
Total control over deciding when to declare a disaster and initiate a failover to the cloud backup. The contract negotiations here focus really heavily on the practical details. Bandwidth caps for uploading backups, ensuring data integrity during transfer, defining the backup frequency, will it be full backups, incremental, differential, and guaranteeing a specific acceptable time frame for restoration when needed.
Okay. Model 2, cloud operations, cloud provider as backup.
Now here, both your primary production systems and your backup systems are hosted by the same cloud provider, just typically in different geographically separate data centers that they own.
How does BCDR work then?
Often, it becomes much more transparent to the customer. The provider usually assumes most of the responsibility for detecting the disaster event, declaring it, and managing the failover process to their secondary site. This capability is often bundled into the service offering, sometimes at little or no extra direct cost. The customer is essentially relying heavily on the provider's contractual service level agreements, SLAs, for availability and recovery.
That sounds simpler, but maybe riskier if the provider fails, which leads to Model 3, cloud operations, third-party cloud backup provider. This sounds complicated.
It is by far the most complex and usually the most expensive arrangement. You have your primary operations running with cloud provider A, but your backups, your DR site, are hosted with a completely separate company, cloud provider B.
Why would anyone choose this complexity?
Several reasons. Maybe to explicitly distribute risk, don't put all your eggs in one provider's basket. It's a strong mitigation against vendor lockout. If provider A goes bust, you still have your data and potentially a recovery path with provider B. Sometimes regulatory requirements might even mandate it.
But managing it must be tough.
Extremely. You now have three parties involved. You, the customer, provider A, and provider B. The contract needs an incredibly complex, explicit, and thoroughly negotiated delineation of roles, responsibilities, and procedures between all three parties. Who declares? Who manages data transfer? Who pays if something goes wrong during transfer?
And technically,
Interoperability issues become a massive concern. You're trying to restore potentially mission-critical systems and data from provider A's environment, possibly using their specific formats or APIs, into provider B's potentially very different environment, often under duress during a real disaster. It requires extensive planning and testing. Legal complexity is also high, especially around data sovereignty if provider B is in a different country. Sometimes, though, this three-party model is the only feasible option to meet specific legal or risk diversification requirements, despite the cost and hassle.
regardless of the model, the procedures for actually declaration and resumption seem absolutely critical. They have to be formalized beforehand.
Non-negotiable. Before any crisis hits, the customer organization must formally assign the authority to declare an emergency. This needs to be a specific person, or maybe an office role, with a clearly named deputy, and they need to be explicitly empowered by senior management. No ambiguity about who can pull the trigger.
And the contract needs specifics.
Absolutely. The contract must clearly define what constitutes formal notice to the provider, if, for example, email to a specific address, phone call to a specific number, portal submission, and, crucially, a guaranteed response time from the provider, for example. They must initiate the agreed-upon failover process within, say, 10 minutes of receiving that formal declaration.
And coming back online, resumption is just as critical to manage formally.
Just as critical, maybe even more prone to error if rushed. Resuming normal operations back at the primary site also requires formal notification and careful planning. The person making that decision needs to fully understand the risks. If you try to fail back too early, before the primary site is fully stable and synchronized,
You can make things worse.
you could extend the disaster, or worse, end up with catastrophic data loss or corruption if the systems aren't perfectly synchronized. It's a highly procedural process that needs to be followed meticulously.
Okay. And finally, the absolute necessity of the testing requirement. Backups aren't backups unless you know they work.
Exactly. Untested backup and recovery plans are functionally useless. They're just hope, not strategy. Failover testing, actually simulating a disaster and switching to the backup environment and return to normal testing, must be performed regularly to prove the plan actually works.
How often?
Industry guidance generally suggests performing full tests at least annually, maybe more frequently, for extremely critical business functions. And this testing absolutely must be coordinated well in advance with the cloud provider.
And the contract needs to cover testing too.
Yes. The contract must explicitly detail all the liabilities involved in the testing process itself. What happens if the test causes an outage or data corruption? Who is responsible for the financial losses incurred during the test window? All of those what-ifs need to be addressed in writing before you start testing. #outro.
Okay, wow. That was a lot to cover. Let's try to unpack this and synthesize the really key learning points from this deep dive into Chapter 5. It seems crystal clear that moving to the cloud fundamentally shifts where the operational control lies.
Right.
But it never, ever truly shifts that ultimate legal burden.
That is the absolute core truth. If you remember one thing, remember that. For anyone studying for the CCSP, the essential takeaways are, first, deeply understand that notional shift in responsibility across IS, PIS, and SaaS. Know exactly what controls you, the customer, retain, and what you hand over in each model.
And second, you absolutely have to internalize the specific risks tied to each deployment model. Especially for the public cloud, those risks of vendor lock-in and lock-out need proactive planning for portability right from the start. Don't forget the multi-tenancy risks either.
Third, you must comprehend the specific countermeasures needed, particularly against those virtualization risks we dove into. Knowing the difference between Type 1 and Type 2 hypervisors, understanding the mechanics of VM escape, and appreciating the value of sophisticated controls like virtual machine introspection, VMI.
And finally, grasping the huge significance of the BCDR contract. It's the ultimate practical expression of that shared responsibility model. Understanding the complexities and coordination challenges of those three potential backup models, especially that tricky three-party arrangement.
Exactly. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We framed the cloud data center throughout this discussion as being conceptually similar to a legacy DMZ fundamentally exposed to the internet. We also talked about the operational difficulty of perfectly implementing things like the Brewer-Nash model's separation across a complex, shared multi-tenant stack. So the question to ponder is this. Given that reality, how does the effective absence of a traditional, strong, fixed network perimeter force organizations to fundamentally shift their security priorities? Does it compel us to rely much more heavily on controls like end-to-end encryption, rigorous data masking, and maybe data dispersion, rather than primarily relying on traditional network-based controls like centralized firewalls and network intrusion detection systems? How does that perimeterless reality change the core of our defense strategy?
That's a great question to chew on. Definitely food for thought about the future of security architecture.